What's up, everybody? My name is Michael Mark Cantonini, the play-by-play voice of the Aberdeen Ironbirds in the South Atlantic League, the high A affiliate of the Baltimore Orioles. I'm happy to be joined by senior baseball writer for The Athletic, Keith Law. Keith, thank you so much for taking the time to do this today, especially with your busy travel schedule and all that.
Oh yeah, sure thing. Happy to join you.
You've written a lot of great stuff lately on all the 30 MLB teams, but specifically, we'll focus on the Orioles. You have in terms of recent articles, you've got your overall top 100 prospects for the 2024 season. You've got the MLB farm system rankings 1 through 30, and then you've got your top 20 prospects in each minor league system. To go off of your overall systems ranking article, you said, quote, "The Orioles have drafted well and developed well and continue to find value where other teams might miss it. For all the hype the Orioles system has received in the last 5 years, it might be better than ever right now," end quote. So to start off with that, why is the Orioles system better off, in your opinion, now than maybe in previous years?
I think the number one reason is a couple of years ago, they finally started participating in international free agency. And, longtime Orioles fans know for forever, they basically didn't play there, or they might go sign one prospect where other teams were obviously signing a few dozen, a couple of significant guys, and then a lot of guys were for lower bonuses to fill out especially short season complex league rosters. We don't have short season anymore. However, teams are still active down there in, I'm thinking particularly Dominican Republic, Venezuela, Colombia, Panama. It's just a huge source of potential talent that the Orioles, for whatever reason, chose not to participate in. And once they started under Mike Elias, when Elias was hired, it was pretty clear he was going to get the Orioles back into international free agency. And now you are starting to see the players, the fruits of that effort show up on top 100 lists, on the Orioles top 20 list, led by Sammy Basayo, but he is far from the only one. You can go see, I would say anything from Bowie on down this year, you will see international free agents signed by the Orioles who look like future big leaguers. And that is something that was not true 4 or 5 years ago. I had several years where I think maybe the lone voice saying, hey, this Orioles system is getting overhyped, because it would be, I do 20 names. Some people do 30 or more, obviously, but I would do 20, the Orioles top 20, and there'd be no international guys. How can you possibly have the best farm system in baseball if you are ignoring where 30% of major league players come from in the first place? Well, now they're no longer doing it. They continue to draft well. They continue to be one of the best development organizations. They've traded quite well. And now they're getting the Sammy Basayos, the Braylon Taveras. They're getting talent from the international free agent pool, which is why I think for all the years that people said the Orioles have the best farm system in baseball, hey, they had a really good farm system. Now they have a complete farm system. And I don't think there's even a really good argument that anyone else could rival them.
When you can now pull the guys that they've drafted and they've done it so well, and then you've got the international guys led by Samuel Basayo, who I got to see for 5 weeks in Aberdeen last year, and he was phenomenal. I mean, just
Yeah,
incredible for
he's
as
fun.
Jackson Holiday was. I mean, Basayo was maybe as impressive. So to go off of that, when you've got that much talent to pull from, who or what are a couple examples of the Orioles finding value that other teams missed, whether it's in the draft or internationally?
Let's look at the Jorge Lopez trade, right? That was, they picked up Lopez on the cheap, right? He had bounced around a couple of organizations. They stuck him in a closer role, and he had some short-term success, and they kind of cashed him in, I think, before the shine came off. They make a trade like that. They get four guys in return. Yennier Cano, who's obviously no longer eligible for the prospect list, but he's been okay in the big leagues. Cade Povich, who's possibly the best starting pitching prospect in the system right now. And two other lower level arms, including Juan Nunez, who I do have on my top 20 at number 17, who's at least been up to 97, and he's got an above average slider, probably a bullpen guy, but still to get three guys who project to some kind of major league value for Jorge Lopez, who didn't even really continue the kind of production that he'd had with Baltimore, is a great example of how the Orioles are finding value in other places. Minnesota is not a bad organization. They are not dumb people. And yet they made a trade that in hindsight is extremely lopsided in the Orioles' favor. So to me, that is probably those are the starkest examples, I would say. I also like the fact that the Orioles, you saw this a little bit more in last year's draft. Now that they've had so much major league success too, they're taking a little bit more risk after the first couple of rounds. But also, even with subsequent picks, they are rolling the dice a little bit more on guys who have a higher risk of busting, but higher reward if things work out. If the Orioles can make some adjustments, or if simply changing a player's environment leads to better results. So I'm very pleased with the things that I'm seeing. I'm certainly not surprised. The Orioles are run by some very, very smart guys, but I'm pleased to see them now change their approach, take on some more risk, because the early approach has now led to major league success.
You've mentioned Mike Elias and his regime and the strides that they've made in multiple areas since, that group took over a handful of years ago. So you've been doing this a long time. You've been around Major League Baseball. You're a former front office executive. You've covered Major League Baseball since 2006 from a media standpoint. How would you compare the recent success in the Orioles organization, whether it be drafting, player development, just overall, from what you've seen elsewhere throughout your career?
They've drafted exceptionally well, particularly up top. And it's not to say I think every single pick is going to work out, but they are among the very best at nailing the first pick, at least getting, with a first round pick, you don't want to walk away with nothing. They are very good at getting players who will play in the big leagues, have played in the big leagues, will play in the big leagues. And there, especially when the Orioles were picking quite a bit higher, that's not likely to be true. It's not true this year. It's not likely to be true for the next several years, I would say. But they made sure that they got what I would consider a minimum level of return on those very high picks. And I think that that alone does separate them from several other teams. We've seen a lot of teams like Oakland, for example, who've really struggled with their first round picks. Kansas City has had some trouble with their first round picks. They've also had some bad luck, but still, proof is in the pudding. Ultimately, you do point to here's what the results are. And the Orioles have not really missed on a first round pick. I mean, we would even go back. Grayson Rodriguez was the previous regime, but it's probably 6 or 7 years now since they had a first round pick who has not really worked out again at that kind of minimum level. I also think that the Orioles have shown themselves, and they've made some changes to who's in player development, but the general philosophy is still there, and they have had a lot of success. I think just helping guys maximize the output from the tools they had. I look at Heston Kjerstad as a great example too. The poor guy missed 2 years, right? COVID, which led to myocarditis, out for, misses 2020 was the pandemic anyway, but then 2021 just misses the entire year. Comes back in 2022, and for much of the year, he didn't look 100%. He just looked a bit slower. He looked a little rusty. His performance was okay, but you'd watch him and say, this isn't the guy he was in 2019, for example. And then this year, you could see the work that they did with him, particularly at cutting down some of the swing and miss in the zone, really come to fruition. Everyone seems to agree this guy is really going to hit and he's going to make hard contact, and the offense is going to be more than enough, regardless of what position he ends up playing. Obviously, the Orioles are going to have to move some pieces around. They have more position players than they have actual spots for these guys. It's a nice problem to have.
Yeah.
But I look at a lot of guys in this system and say they've gotten better because of the Orioles, that they wouldn't have had necessarily the same career path somewhere else. That doesn't mean they've succeeded with everybody.
There's only so many spots where guys can play, whether it's, a position player or a pitcher, and there's just so much talent. There's so much depth, and we've already seen the Orioles trade from depth. It started with the Jack Flaherty trade last year, and then of course, this offseason, Corbin Burnes. And I got to imagine that that's just the beginning. I mean, there's more trades to be made this year, deadline, next offseason, because there's a certain window to win, especially when your top big league talent is so cheap, pre-arbitration and all that. So what do you think is next from the Orioles? Where do they go from here post Burnes trade?
Yeah, it's a great question. And let's, take a step back too and talk about the Burnes trade for just 1 second, if we can.
Yeah.
Joey Ortiz, I think, is the best prospect they've traded so far. Ortiz he's been on my top 100 for several years. I think he's a consensus top 100 prospect. Most folks I know look at him and say, at worst, you have an everyday shortstop. Just a solid, average, regular shortstop. He can really play the position, hits the ball pretty hard, and doesn't swing and miss very much. And he's a little older because obviously he was a pre-pandemic draft out of college. Another guy the Orioles actually give him all the credit. I feel like they could take a little bit of credit. Swing change, body change, got a lot stronger during the layoff in 2020, comes back the following year, very different swing, very different body, totally changed his outlook. They were willing to trade him. Now, they have no room for him. There is no scenario where you're getting another shortstop, right? They have Gunnar Henderson and Jackson Holliday steaming his way towards the big leagues, and Jordan Westburg is hanging around. Like there's no place for Ortiz to play anyway. But it was a really good sign that they were willing to part with a player like Ortiz, who is so highly regarded, who they did such a good job with. Now, I see going forward still a surplus of position players where they can continue to make trades. And I think they're going to have to make some tough decisions and decide who they're willing to bet on, because they're going to have to keep someone who's unproven and trade someone who's unproven, and hope that they make the right decision, right? You're not really going to have enough space for Kierstad and Kobe Mayo, who may very well end up in an outfield corner, and there's a chance he ends up at first base, and Colton Cowser and Dylan Beavers, both of whom are just straight up outfielders, and Connor Norby, who can really hit and gets on base, but doesn't really have a very clear position. These guys just can't all play for the Orioles. That's not a possibility. And I didn't even mention, Ryan Mountcastle is already there at first base, and Enrique Bradfield Jr. is the best center fielder defensively in the system. And no, he might be 2 years away, but he's going to contribute to the logjam. So I think of that little list of position players I just mentioned: Kierstad, Mayo, Hauser, Beavers, Norby, and you could probably throw Westberg in there too, because he's too good to be a backup. Two or three of those guys are not Orioles, I think, by this time next year. And whether maybe nothing happens now because we're in spring training, maybe nothing happens till the trade deadline, but they have the players to go out and get another impact starter. And my guess is that's what they're going to need. I would have probably said that before the Kyle Bradish injury. Now I just think it's even more important. Whenever there's a really good and even an above average starting pitcher available in the trade market, the Orioles can probably beat just about any offer, and they should be there to do so. They should be willing to say, here's a list of 5 prospects who are, top 100, highly regarded globally, ready to step in in the majors right now at the minimum salary, and say, take 3. Just take 3 of these guys, and we'll take that starting pitcher in return. Or maybe it's that starting pitcher, and we'll just take that reliever who you don't think is very good, but we think he's, Yenny or Cano part 2 or something. I think they end up doing a trade like that this year. I would also argue that they probably are going to have to try to repeat the success they had from the regular season in 23.
Well, incredible stuff, Keith. I really appreciate the insight and you taking the time for this conversation. My name is Michael Marcantonini, Keith Law, senior writer for The Athletic. Keith, thanks so much for taking the time.
Yeah, my pleasure.